Amy Roloff had spent most of her life being strong for others. Strength was not something she chose. It was something life demanded from her again and again. From marriage to motherhood, from public exposure to private disappointment, she carried responsibility quietly, often without acknowledgement. Over time, the woman who once held an entire family together began to feel increasingly alone inside that same family. Familiar faces became distant, conversations became formal, and emotional warmth slowly disappeared, replaced by routine and silence. After years of change, separation, and emotional strain, Amy's life had entered a quieter phase. The noise of constant conflict had faded, but so had the sense of belonging. Some relationships had grown colder, not through open hostility, but through absence, missed calls, unreturned concern, and the unspoken agreement to stay emotionally distant. Amy noticed it, but she did not complain. She had learned long ago that endurance often required silence. Chris Marek was one of the few people who still paid attention to her emotional state. He saw the fatigue behind her smile and the weight she carried without expressing. Their connection was built on presence rather than promises. While the world around Amy moved forward without slowing down for her, Chris stayed close, grounded, and attentive in ways that felt increasingly rare. The day of the accident did not begin with tragedy. It began like any other ordinary day. Amy drove alone, her thoughts scattered between responsibilities, memories, and quiet reflections. There was no rush, no visible danger, no sign that the day would end differently from all the others. The road was familiar, the moment unremarkable. Then, without warning, the collision occurred, sudden, violent, and irreversible. Metal crashed, glass shattered, and the calm of routine disappeared in an instant. Amy's body absorbed the impact, leaving her injured, disoriented, and struggling to remain conscious. Pain blurred her senses as time seemed to slow around her. She was trapped between awareness and unconsciousness, her breath shallow, her strength fading. Chris reached the scene quickly. Shock did not stop him from acting. He stayed close, speaking to her continuously, urging her not to close her eyes, reminding her that she was not alone. His voice became a lifeline, cutting through the chaos and fear surrounding them. He applied pressure where needed, called for help, and refused to step away even as panic crept into his thoughts. Emergency responders arrived and took over, stabilizing Amy as best they could before transporting her to the hospital. The drive felt endless. Every minute carried uncertainty. Doctors worked urgently, assessing injuries, running tests, and delivering carefully chosen words that balanced realism with cautious hope. Amy was alive, but her condition was serious. Nothing was guaranteed. Hospital days have a strange way of distorting time. Hours stretch longer than they should, nights blur into mornings, and every sound feels amplified. Chris remained nearby, watching machines breathe for her, holding on to the possibility that survival was still within reach. He waited for news, for improvement, for any sign that her strength would once again carry her through. During those days, absence became impossible to ignore. Some people who had once shared decades of life with Amy did not appear. There were no rushed arrivals, no urgent concern, no visible effort to be present. Whether driven by emotional distance, unresolved history, or deliberate choice, the lack of response was unmistakable. Amy lay unconscious while silence filled the spaces where support should have been. 3 days passed. On the third day, the doctor's expressions changed. Conversations became quieter, more final. Amy Roloff passed away without regaining full awareness, her life ending not in chaos but in stillness. The machine slowed, then stopped. Chris was there when the room fell silent, forced to accept that effort, love, and hope do not always change outcomes. The news of her death spread, but reactions were uneven. Some expressed grief from a distance, others remained silent. On the day Amy died, certain people who had once been central to her life were not present at all. No hospital visit. No final goodbye. Their absence was not loud, but it was deeply felt by those who remained. Amy's death left behind more than sorrow. It left questions about responsibility, about emotional neglect, about what happens when people stop showing up long before life actually ends. Her story did not conclude with the accident itself. It ended with reflection, exposing the quiet consequences of distance, indifference, and unresolved relationships within a family that once stood together in public view. Amy Roloff's death did not bring closure. Instead, it opened a long silence that settled heavily over everyone connected to her life. In the days following the accident, grief expressed itself unevenly. Some people cried openly, some stayed quiet, and some chose distance over presence. The absence that had surrounded Amy during her final days now followed her even after death, lingering like an unanswered question no one was willing to confront directly. Chris Marek remained alone in his grief. He replayed every moment in his mind: the accident, the hospital lights, the 3 days of waiting, and the final silence. He questioned whether more could have been done, even though reason told him he had done everything possible. Guilt mixed with sorrow, not because of failure, but because love had not been enough to change the outcome. He carried the weight of being present when others were not, a burden that offered no comfort. The funeral arrangements became a quiet reflection of Amy's final days. Decisions were made with minimal discussion. Some family members participated from a distance, offering statements instead of presence. Others remained completely absent, choosing not to attend at all. The lack of unity was impossible to ignore. What should have been a moment of collective mourning instead highlighted years of emotional separation. Public reactions were controlled and measured. Words were chosen carefully, emotions restrained. Behind closed doors, however, tension surfaced. Questions were asked without answers. Why had help not come sooner? Why had support disappeared when it was needed most? These questions lingered, unspoken but deeply felt, creating an emotional divide that could no longer be hidden by politeness or public image. Matt Roloff and Caryn Chandler continued their lives with visible distance from the tragedy. Whether through choice or emotional detachment, they did not step forward during Amy's final moments, nor did they make themselves present on the day she died. Their absence became a quiet source of resentment, not expressed openly, but felt deeply by those who had stayed. The children struggled in different ways. Grief manifested as confusion, anger, and silence. Memories of childhood, family gatherings, and a time when their parents still stood together resurfaced unexpectedly. Amy's role as the emotional center of the family became clearer only after she was gone. Without her, communication fractured further, and unresolved tensions rose to the surface. Chris found himself isolated not only by grief, but by realization. He understood that love and loyalty are measured not by words, but by presence. Amy had shown up for others throughout her life, even when it cost her emotionally. In the end, the imbalance of that devotion became impossible to ignore. As days turned into weeks, the reality settled in. Amy Roloff was gone, but the consequences of her absence were only beginning. Relationships strained further, silence grew heavier, and the truth emerged slowly. The accident had ended her life, but emotional distance had already surrounded her long before the crash ever happened. Amy Roloff's absence slowly transformed from shock into something heavier and more permanent. The house she once filled with movement and quiet authority now felt hollow, as if the walls themselves were waiting for someone who would never return. Her presence had been subtle but constant, and only after her death did those around her realize how much emotional labor she had carried without recognition. Chris Marek struggled to return to anything resembling normal life. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by memories that refused to settle. He remembered the sound of her voice, the way she tried to remain composed even when hurt, and the moments when she chose peace over confrontation. Grief did not come in waves for him, it stayed, steady and unrelenting. He felt anger at times, not loud or explosive, but quiet and persistent, directed at the unfairness of loss and the imbalance of care Amy had endured. Conversations within the family became increasingly strained. When Amy's name was mentioned, reactions varied. Some avoided the topic entirely, others spoke of her in careful, distant terms. No one openly discussed the days following the accident, yet those days hovered over every interaction. The silence surrounding those moments became its own form of communication, revealing discomfort, avoidance, and unresolved guilt. Matt Roloff remained emotionally distant. His grief, if present, was internal and controlled, expressed through routine rather than reflection. He did not speak publicly about the accident or the days Amy spent in the hospital. Instead, life continued forward, structured and orderly, as if acknowledging the depth of loss might disrupt the stability he relied on. This distance was interpreted differently by those watching. Some saw it as coping, others as indifference. Caryn Chandler mirrored that distance. She did not insert herself into the family's grief, nor did she offer visible comfort to those struggling. Her silence was consistent, deliberate, and unbroken. Whether motivated by personal boundaries or emotional detachment, her absence during Amy's final moments remained an unspoken point of tension. It was not confrontation that followed, but quiet judgment, carried in looks and unfinished sentences. The The children wrestled with grief in private ways. Memories surfaced unexpectedly, small moments, ordinary conversations, shared laughter that now felt painfully significant. Each of them processed Amy's death differently, but all shared a sense of unfinished understanding. There were questions they never asked her, feelings they never expressed, and assumptions they never challenged. Her absence made those gaps impossible to ignore. Chris eventually confronted the reality that grief had changed him. He no longer viewed relationships through the lens of longevity or history, but through presence and accountability. Amy had shown up consistently, even when doing so cost her emotionally. In her final days, that consistency was not returned equally. Accepting this truth was painful, but unavoidable. As time passed, public interest faded, but private consequences intensified. Family gatherings became rare, and when they did occur, they felt formal and restrained. Conversations stayed on the surface, avoiding emotional depth. The fracture that Amy's death revealed did not heal with time. It widened slowly, fueled by avoidance rather than conflict. Chris began to speak quietly about Amy, not publicly but to those willing to listen. He spoke of her patience, her resilience, and her unacknowledged sacrifices. In doing so, he preserved a version of her that was honest and complete, not shaped by convenience or selective memory. These conversations were not accusations, they were reminders of who she truly was. Amy Roloff's story, once shared openly with the world, now existed in fragments. Memories held by those who chose to remember fully, and silence maintained by those who did not. Her death had ended a life, but it had also exposed emotional truths long buried beneath routine and familiarity. The family continued forward, but something essential had been lost, not only in the accident, but in the years leading up to it. Amy Roloff's absence no longer felt sudden. It had settled into daily life with a quiet permanence that reshaped every routine, every relationship, and every unspoken understanding within the family. What began as grief slowly evolved into something more complex, a long reckoning with choices made over years, with emotional distance that could no longer be dismissed as misunderstanding or timing. The house that once symbolized shared history now felt divided by invisible lines. Objects remained where Amy had left them, but their meaning changed. Familiar spaces no longer offered comfort. Instead, they served as reminders of presence without protection, of contribution without reciprocation. Amy's role as mediator, caretaker, and emotional anchor became unmistakably clear only after it vanished. Chris Marek carried forward with a sense of responsibility that went beyond grief. He felt compelled to preserve the truth of who Amy was, not the simplified version that emerged after her death. He noticed how quickly narratives became selective, how people spoke of her strength while ignoring the weight she carried, how her patience was praised while the reasons she needed it were quietly avoided. This imbalance disturbed him deeply. Conversations between Chris and other family members became increasingly strained. There was no open confrontation, but there was resistance to examining the past honestly, resistance to acknowledging absence as a choice rather than circumstance. Silence remained the preferred language, not because nothing needed to be said, but because saying it would require accountability. Matt Roloff continued forward with structured normalcy. His days were filled with routine, decisions, and long-term planning, as if forward motion could compensate for unresolved emotional ground. He did not publicly revisit the days surrounding the accident, nor did he acknowledge the emotional impact of not being present. This distance hardened over time, becoming less about grief and more about avoidance. Caryn Chandler remained aligned with that distance. She did not attempt to reframe the past, nor did she engage in conversations about Amy's final days. Her detachment was consistent, offering no explanation and no visible reflection. To some, this appeared as composure. To others, it felt like erasure. Regardless of interpretation, her absence during critical moments remained a silent divider. The children felt caught between loyalty and truth. Each of them grappled privately with conflicting emotions: love for their father, grief for their mother, and confusion about how things had unfolded. They remembered Amy's sacrifices clearly now, the way she held space for everyone else while minimizing her own needs. With her gone, those memories sharpened rather than softened. Family gatherings, when they occurred, felt carefully managed. Topics remained safe, emotional depth avoided. There were pauses in conversation that spoke louder than words, moments when Amy's absence filled the room more fully than any living presence. No one openly addressed the fractures, yet everyone felt them. Chris eventually reached a turning point. Grief no longer demanded isolation, it demanded honesty. He began to understand that remaining silent would allow convenient versions of the past to take root. Without accusation or dramatization, he started to speak openly about presence, responsibility, and what it truly means to show up. His words were not confrontational, but they unsettled those who preferred closure without reflection. Public perception continued to fade, but private consequences intensified. Relationships did not collapse dramatically, they thinned slowly, weakened by avoidance and unresolved tension. Amy's death had not united the family. It had revealed the fragile state it had already been in. What remained was not anger, but clarity. The accident had ended Amy's life, but it did not explain the loneliness that surrounded her before it. That loneliness was the product of years, not moments. And now, without her steady presence, everyone left behind was forced to confront the emotional cost of distance they had once accepted as normal. Amy Roloff's legacy no longer belonged to public memory or controlled narratives. It lived in quiet realizations, in discomfort, and in the slow understanding that love is not measured by history or titles, but by action, especially when it is inconvenient, uncomfortable, or required most. Time did not soften what Amy Roloff's absence had revealed. Instead, it clarified it. Months passed, then more, and life continued outwardly as it always does, but beneath routine and habit, a permanent shift had taken place. The family no longer moved around a shared center. Without Amy, there was no quiet force pulling everyone toward understanding, compromise, or empathy. What remained was distance, managed, polite, and deeply rooted. Chris Marek learned that grief does not always demand tears. Sometimes it demands truth. He stopped waiting for acknowledgement that would never come and stopped expecting reflection from those unwilling to examine the past. He carried Amy's memory forward not as a symbol, but as a person, complex, patient, and consistently present in ways that were now impossible to deny. He understood that remembrance is an action, not a statement. Matt Roloff continued building toward the future, but the absence of emotional reckoning became increasingly apparent. Forward motion created structure, but it did not replace resolution. The choice not to engage with the final days, not to revisit unanswered questions, became permanent through repetition. What was once temporary distance hardened into emotional finality. Caryn Chandler remained unchanged in her detachment. Her role in the unfolding aftermath was defined by what she did not do rather than what she did. She neither confronted nor reinterpreted the past. Silence remained her position, and over time, silence became its own statement. The children eventually stopped waiting for clarity from others and began finding it within themselves. Each of them reached understanding in different ways, some through memory, some through distance, some through acceptance. They recognized that Amy's love had been constant even when circumstances were not, and that her sacrifices had been real regardless of how quietly they were made. Family connections did not disappear completely, but they transformed. Interaction became minimal, controlled, and emotionally guarded. What once existed as shared history no longer functioned as shared responsibility. Amy's absence exposed the limits of connection that had existed long before the accident. Chris reached a point where grief no longer defined his days. It remained present, but it no longer controlled him. He accepted that some losses do not come with apologies, explanations, or closure. He also accepted that honoring Amy meant refusing to let her story be simplified, minimized, or selectively remembered. In the end, Amy Roloff's life was not defined by the accident that took her, but by the quiet endurance that preceded it. Her death did not create distance, it revealed it. What followed was not collapse, but clarity. A recognition that presence matters most when it is difficult, that love requires action beyond convenience, and that absence, once chosen, cannot be undone by time. Amy's legacy lived on not in public memory or shared narratives, but in the understanding left behind. An understanding that strength is often unseen, that care is not guaranteed by proximity, and that showing up, fully, consistently, and without condition, is the true measure of connection. Her story ended without reconciliation, without confrontation, and without resolution that satisfied everyone. But it ended honestly. And sometimes, honesty is the only ending that remains.